Today is Wednesday, November 17th, and Rabbi Moffic, as we begin, first they came for the Jews.
Okay, so everybody, I thought we would talk today about, this is chapter 9 of the book, and it's about the relationship between, well, it's really about the rise of Islamic anti-Semitism. And all of our classes so far have focused on anti-Semitism within Christianity, which makes sense because we live in the West. You know, we are part of the Western world, and the kind of anti-Semitism that most of us experienced is really rooted in Christianity, or at least in the type of Christianity that arose in the Western world. But as I've said several times, relations between Jews and Christians have really never been better in history. I mean, we're in a sort of a golden age, if you want to think about it, between Jews and Christians. I mean, you've got the Pope, who's one of his best friends is a rabbi. You've got, I mean, even it just really, it's extraordinary. In Chicago, they're at the Catholic Theological Union. There are professors of Jewish studies. You know, I mean, really, it's a, you know, even though there's, you know, still some anti-Semitism, Jews and Christians get along better now than really any time in history. However, the reverse is true also. Relations between Jews and Muslims have rarely been worse. And I think we can understand a little bit of that by looking at the history. So the very earliest history comes from the Torah, right? Where we have Abraham is promised a son, and his first son does not come from Sarah. It comes from Hagar, and who is Sarah's maid, essentially. And that son is named Ishmael. Well, Abraham loves Ishmael, but once Sarah has a child, Ishmael and Hagar have to get out of the house. It's like almost like a soap opera, but it is what it is. So Hagar and Ishmael leave, and ultimately, according to Torah, Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab nations. He becomes the progenitor of the Arab world. And so now, interestingly, if you come to Torah study, you would know that this story is somewhat, it's etiological. Now, what does etiological mean? Etiological means that these are stories that are used to explain why the world is the way it is. And
Whoops.
Arabs and Jews don't get along, essentially. They don't get along because a long time ago, Abraham sold his son into, or didn't sell his son, but banished his son and wife from, or concubine from their home. And this created some tension between Jews and Arab peoples. So it's who knows whether the story is literally true or not, but the nature of it is such that it starts the relations between Jews and Arabs with some tension. However, remember, Arab and Muslim is not always the same thing, right? It is now. I mean, well, not actually, it isn't even now. There are Arab Christians, plenty of Arab Christians, but in general, you know, most of the Arab world is Muslim. Islam as a religion doesn't really emerge until around 600, between 600 and 650 CE. And obviously, if you know any history, you know that really Islam is started by Muhammad. And Muhammad conquers a whole area around the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the first groups that he conquers is a group of Jews in an area called Khaybar. And Muhammad believed that Jews would ultimately subscribe to this more pure form of monotheism, Islam, his religion, and Jews didn't. The fact that Jews didn't convert to this new religion created tension. But ultimately, Muhammad succeeded in conquering all of the Arabian Peninsula, and instead of converting, Jews essentially became second-class citizens in Muslim-controlled areas. They were governed by a law known as dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. And dhimmi, the dhimmi law said that Jews had to give about 50% of their harvest to their Muslim rulers. And if you lived in an urban area, you had a special tax. But dhimmi also came with the benefit that essentially you were protected, that you would not be murdered for any religious reason. And if Christians invaded the Muslim area, you would be protected there too. So it's interestingly the status of Jews in Islam. They are certainly second-class citizens. And this dhimmi tax is essentially meant to humiliate Jews. Yet they warranted certain legal protections. And in fact, Martin Gilbert, he's a great historian of Jews and Judaism, said that some rulers in Muslim areas emphasized the protections more than the humiliations. He writes, during the 2 centuries following the death of Muhammad, Muslim rulers developed conflicting approaches towards their Jewish subjects. The difference in their approaches revealed an internal struggle within Islam, one that swung rulers between the 2 extremes of protection and intolerance. So this goes back and forth. Certain Muslim countries are very good. Well, I wouldn't say good, but better for Jews, and others are bad. And in the good places, in the better places, Jews ultimately reached very high levels of success. I mean, think of Spain in the golden age of Spain. Think of Egypt. For a good part of the 11th century, Spain and Egypt, there were Jews that were essentially at the highest echelons of government and economics and so forth, and culture. Yet at the same time, even within decades, there were periods of extraordinary tension. In 1066, there was a famous incident where a very influential Jew named Samuel ibn Negrella, you can even see in his name, the influence, Samuel ibn Negrella, there was a rumor going around that he was planning to set up a separate state. And so immediately after that, there was essentially a pogrom. 5,000 Jews were killed in 1 year. And that was actually more than were murdered at the beginning of the Crusades. So this is in 1066. Now in 1066 in Europe, a whole nother thing was happening with Charlemagne and so forth. But in essence, you know, there were some bad experiences in Muslim-controlled territories. However, this is one of the key differences. In Islam, there doesn't have the same kind of tension between Judaism and Islam as between Judaism and Christianity. This is what Bernard Lewis, who is another great historian of Islam, wrote. He taught at Princeton. Muslims did not conceive or present themselves as the new and true Israel. They did not therefore feel threatened or impugned by the obstinate survival of the old Israel. In other words, Christianity saw itself as replacing Judaism. Islam did not see themselves that way. They saw themselves as the purest form of monotheism, but it wasn't as if there wasn't the same conversionary zeal in Islam to convert Jews as there was in Christianity. And there wasn't the same kind of, there was never an inquisition in Muslim areas. There wasn't a desire to hunt out Jews and force them to convert or be murdered. There was humiliation and second-class citizenship, but if you essentially, to kind of sum it up, if you could choose a place to live as a Jew before, let's say, 1850, you would easily choose a Muslim country over a Christian country. Unless you were, say, a wealthy Jew in Germany or France, okay? You could, that was a different, but that was a very small percentage. If you were just an average Joe Jew on the street, you would be much safer and you would prefer to live in a Muslim area rather than a Christian area up until about 1850. Now, what starts to happen around 1850, or really the 19th century? Well, you got to see what happens in Islamic areas in the context of broader historical trends. So starting in about the 16th century, we begin the rise of the West. Essentially, Western Europe generally, become more advanced in their civilizations than Arab world. That's partly because of the conquest of the New World. That's partly because of technology and the Enlightenment and so forth. So essentially, and as a result, there is a huge movement of Christian missionaries into the Muslim world. This kind of, as Europe becomes wealthier and militarily stronger, they become more like imperial powers, imperialism. And part of that imperialism is the entry of Westerners, especially Western Christians, into Muslim areas. And that creates tension. It's same tension that exists today. But this is the sort of origins of it. And Jews essentially become a proxy for the West. And there was a famous incident in 1840, it's called the Damascus Affair. And by the way, this Damascus Affair actually leads to the creation of the first kind of major secular Jewish defense organization, like the early equivalent of the American Jewish Committee. It's called the Alliance Juive Française, something like the Jewish Alliance of France. But essentially what happens is in Syria, which was which of course is an Arab country, a Muslim country, the French council, this French council believed that Jewish merchants were taking business from Christian merchants. So this French consul general convinced Muslim authorities that a group of Jews had kidnapped a Christian child, had kidnapped a Catholic monk and his assistants and murdered them and used their blood to make matzah, the old blood libel, which we've talked about before. So this Christian French ambassador convinced Muslim authorities that Jews had kidnapped Christians to make blood, to make matzah with their blood. And the Muslim authorities went into the Jewish quarter. There are riots, and essentially those 8 Jews who had been accused of it were all murdered. And this marks the first instance of the blood libel in a Muslim country. Remember, the blood libel had been part of Christian Europe for centuries. This is the first time we see it in the Arab world. And there were riots. Local Muslims rioted, burning down the main synagogue and destroying Torah scrolls. And those 8 Jews who were accused of kidnapping the Catholic monk and his assistants were tortured and executed. And this was the first, well, maybe not the first, but the first major incident in a long time where Jews were specifically targeted viciously in a Muslim country. And I write this in the book. I'll just read it from what I wrote because I expressed it better in writing. The Damascus Affair signaled greater tension and violence to come, as anxiety about the West mingled with the arrival of Christian anti-Semitic stereotypes. Anti-Semitism rose. As Bernard Lewis puts it, with the changed circumstances of the era of European domination, the non-Muslim ceased to be contemptible in Muslim eyes, contemptible being the earlier status, and became dangerous. In the case of the Jews, this new attitude was further encouraged by the importation of certain ideas characteristic of European anti-Semitism, but previously unknown even to the most prejudiced Islamic opponents of Jews and other non-Muslims. In other words, Jews became a convenient victim of anti-Western sentiment. This is like the equivalent 200 years ago. You sometimes hear today, Israel is the little Satan and the US is the great Satan. Well, this is the same thing. Jews are the little Satan and the West is the great Satan. And so this tension, this feeling of being second-class citizens towards the West in the 1800s is taken out against Jews. Okay, questions so far? Because then we have a whole nother dimension to add to that this new kind of anti-Semitism, and that comes in the rise of Zionism, the state of Israel. But before that, any questions about this beginning of Islamic anti-Semitism? Anybody? I can't see any hands. Anybody? Okay, then let's go on. Okay, so remember, through most of history, there is always a small Jewish presence in the land of Israel, but it's always very small and it's relatively insignificant. Very few Jews lived in Palestine, or it all went by all kinds of different names. And that's because it's a relatively economic backwater. There's not much going on in Palestine, partly because, you know, much of the Arab world is an economic backwater, and this area is relatively unimportant. But there's always a small Jewish population there. But as anti-Semitism begins to grow or accelerates in Europe, and Jews become modern, it's really interesting. There's two phenomena going on at the same time. Jews are assimilating, but anti-Semitism is also growing. So as a result, there is a new movement, the modern Zionist movement. And the modern Zionist movement says, we want to create a modern state, not the biblical state of Israel, but a modern state of Israel, reflecting modern values so that we can escape the anti-Semitism of Europe. And what's the natural spot for that state? Well, historic Israel. Even though this will be a modern state, it will have resonance with the biblical land of Israel. And so, starting really modern Zionism, really, I mean, Theodor Herzl writes The Jewish State in 1896, but even 40 years before that, starting about 1860, there is a movement of Jews from Europe towards Palestine. And at that time, Palestine, there were certainly Arabs living there, but they weren't very, the land was mostly owned by Arab nobles who lived in, you know, other parts of the Ottoman Empire, mainly Turkey, modern day Iran, that whole area. So the land was owned by people living far away and people who lived on the land. They lived there for centuries, but they didn't actually own it. And Jews started migrating there, very small at first, but they were supported by prominent philanthropists, Montefiore, then the Rothschilds, and so forth. And Jews started going there. Tiny numbers, though. In the beginning, there's very little tension, right? I mean, if a small number of Jews are coming and they're, you know, minding their own business, there's very little tension. However, starting in 1881, with the assassination of the Tsar in Russia, there is a wave of pogroms. We know all about that. There's, you know, we've studied that history. Pogroms start spreading across Eastern Europe, and Jews start migrating in much greater numbers to Palestine. So the modern Zionist movement really starts to grow. Now, what happens when as more Jews move into Palestine? Tensions grow. Tensions accelerate. And there is a critical difference. Starting in the beginning of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, Jews who were immigrating to Palestine believed they had this idea, it was sort of a romantic idea, that Jews should be self-sufficient, that Jews should work the land. The first generation of Jewish immigrants to Palestine, they hired lots of Arab laborers. The second generation, though, they said, we're going to farm the land ourselves. This was the idea of returning to the land. And so as a result, the Jews who are coming to Palestine aren't providing jobs, essentially, if you want to put in modern terminology, they're not providing jobs for the Arabs that are living there. So tensions start to mount. And as I write in the book, those tensions became more acute as Jewish immigration to Palestine accelerated in the 1920s. And as the United States implemented drastic immigration restrictions, leading even more Jews to immigrate to Palestine. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, envisioning a future Jewish national homeland, also led to organizational Arab opposition. It was a symbol of Western imperialism and Jewish power. In 1929, rumors that Jews were planning to take control of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem led to an outbreak of violence in the city of Hebron, leading almost 70 Jews dead and several synagogues destroyed. The 1930s witnessed ongoing and increasing hostility as Jews left Europe and Arabs and Jews competed for British support. That tension grew when the Islamic leader of Jerusalem, known as the Mufti, allied himself with Hitler. So essentially, you've got two forces leading to a tremendous uptick in Islamic anti-Semitism. One, you've got tension between Islam and the West. Western imperial countries coming into the Middle East, establishing, France controlled Syria, Britain ultimately controlled Palestine with the British Mandate. And so you have this tension between Western powers and local groups. Then you have Jews coming to Palestine and establishing a Jewish state. And so these two tensions erupt. They erupt. And really, they just grow. They grow tremendously. So in 1948, you have the establishment of the State of Israel, and immediately you have war with surrounding Arab countries. That war ends not with any kind of peace agreement, but with simply a cessation of hostilities. And essentially, in the 50s and early 60s, there's tension between Jews and Muslims, but it's not horrible. By the way, there's no such thing as the word Palestinian doesn't exist. I believe the first usage of the phrase Palestinian is like in 1963 or 1964. But there's tension. Sue, you've got your hand up before I get into the next phase. Yeah.
Yeah, Rabbi, I think something that I don't know I can't remember that you wrote it in the book, but the people today don't look at Palestine as a country. They think it was a country with a central government, which it wasn't until Yasser Arafat came from Egypt and turned it that way, because it was just a land of tribes. There was no central government. It wasn't a country. It wasn't a state. And people think that the Jews stole this country from them.
Right.
And that is not true.
Right.
Am I correct?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. That doesn't mean we can't sympathize with Palestinians, of course, right. But the idea that there was a state called Palestine, it's not true. That the Arabs who lived in Palestine were known as Arabs. It was, they were part of the Arab Middle East. It wasn't a separate country. Like Iran, there was always a sort of Persian Arab culture, and that was really Iran. And there was always a kind of, I think it's a Sunni Muslim culture, which was where the Palestinians were, with sort of the Arab Middle East, kind of like Saudi Arabia. So there were people that lived on the land for hundreds of years. There's no question that there were Arab families that felt tied to the land, that lived there for hundreds of years. However, there was not a political entity known as Palestine. Yeah, Jill.
These people that lived in Palestine, you say the land was owned by others outside of Palestine.
Right.
When did that change? And why are they now saying this is ours? When did that change?
Well, that's a complicated question. So, the idea of ownership of land, the West, we have our own idea of ownership, and those ideas don't always fit within the Arab context. So essentially, the land was owned by a group called Effendis, who were essentially feudal lords, but they didn't live there. So they controlled it, and they technically owned it because it was all part of the Ottoman Empire. and these were sort of the court officials or the elites of the Ottoman Empire. So they technically owned the land, but it wasn't like the people paid rent. It wasn't like the Palestinians or Arabs who were living there paid rent. They lived there, and they lived there for generations, and it was almost as if they owned it, but they didn't technically own it. So it doesn't really fit our idea of ownership. They didn't hold title, essentially. These people living elsewhere held title, but that's it. Like they raised children there. They didn't pay rent there. It was essentially their land and everything except title. Now, when did that change? Well, the Jewish National Fund, which is part of the beginning of in partnership with the Jewish Agency, essentially, begins to purchase this land so that they could hold title. And the Jewish Agency purchases the land from the owners who held title. Now, remember, the people who lived there, they might not have even known that someone else held title. They might have had no idea. They probably knew that maybe they didn't hold title, but the idea of title it wasn't even as prominent an idea as we understand it now. So for all intents and purposes, the people who lived there believed it was their land and everything except title, but the title was actually held by somebody else. And Jews who came in, who suddenly held title and said, get out, were kind of breaking 300 years of that not really mattering. So that's where some of the tension came in. Even though they didn't own the land, they effectively owned it. It's complicated. Yeah. Mom and Dad, you had your hand up.
I was going to ask about who the Jewish National Fund paid. I knew the Jewish National Fund had bought the land, but I was wondering, and you answered the question.
Right. Yeah, it was, and I mean, this can actually help us understand some of the tension. If you've lived in this land for hundreds of years, and then suddenly somebody else says, well, I hold title now to this land, you got to get off, that can create tension. There's no question. It created, there were essentially the early Zionists, they really didn't take into account Arabs who were living there. That's it's not wrong to say that. I mean, you have to look at the history. There were people living there who felt that it was their land, even though they didn't hold title to it. It's just part of the history. And essentially, there was a hope. The early Zionists, they were not bad people. They believed that as the land was developed, that prosperity would help everybody. It's kind of like, okay, if we can build a farm and produce, more food from this land, then everybody's going to get richer and everyone's going to enjoy more food. If we can build a factory, everyone's going to have more jobs. So there was a hope that, a rising tide lifts all boats. By the way, that was the same hope behind the Oslo Accords 100 years later, that when you have people who work together to develop the land and build an economy from it, that can overcome some of the religious and identity tensions. Obviously, it didn't work. We hoped it would work. Doesn't always work that way. And in 1967, it gets a lot worse. It gets a lot worse. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First is that even though Israel essentially won the war in 1948, it wasn't a huge victory. Israel essentially defended its own, and East Jerusalem remained a part of Jordan. And Israel was a very small country and a very relatively poor country. It wasn't like Israel today is a very wealthy country in terms of the economy and technology. That was not the case. So, Israel kind of was really focused on, basically surviving in that area. And the Arab world was in its own turmoil at that time. It it was the era of imperialism was ending. Arab nations were becoming nationalist. So there wasn't, the focus was not on tension between Jews and Arabs. Each had their other things to focus on. But then in 1967, there's the Six-Day War. And essentially that leads to a tremendous reversal of power. Essentially, Israel becomes a much larger, stronger country, and the Arab world is humiliated. I mean, I wasn't alive at the time. Some people on this, here were. The Arab world is humiliated. Israel triples in size in 3 days or 6 days, and these great Arab nations are really destroyed in battle, and that just creates even more tension between Jews and Arabs. And part of that tension is the notion of humiliation. Part of it is a new kind of strand in Zionism, which religious Zionism, which believes that Jews should occupy all of the biblical land of Israel. So this is the origins of the settlement movement. Settlement movement doesn't really grow until the 80s and 90s, but its origins are here. And the idea is that the Arabs who live, instead of Jews being the second-class citizens in Arab countries, now the Arabs who live in Israel can be second-class citizens in a Jewish country. Essentially, that is essentially not in Israel proper. Arabs are not second-class citizens. Economically they are, but not legally. And that's a whole nother discussion. But in the territories area, there is a different set of laws for Jews and for Arabs. And that creates this new set of tensions. And that ignites, it grows anti-Semitism. And so the relationship between Jews and Muslims has a whole different context for it. This is the anti-Semitism in the Muslim world now really has sort of 3 key components. The first is a rejection of the legitimacy of Israel. That's number 1. Number 2 is the growth of these European Christian anti-Semitic ideas suddenly grow in the Arab world, like the blood libel. And third, and this is sort of the next phase, is a kind of distortion of the meaning of human rights. So, we know, essentially, you can almost see the evolution of Islamic anti-Semitism in the role of the United Nations. Not interesting. So the United Nations, in the beginning, it's because of the United Nations that Israel is established, right? That Russia and the United States in 1948 and the UN overwhelmingly support the creation of the state of Israel. And it's seen as a pro-human rights act. Jews suffered during the Holocaust, therefore we need a state of Israel. But as the balance shifts and Israel becomes a stronger country, the notion of human rights becomes such that Jews are abusing human rights, that Israel is abusing human rights. And that becomes a cudgel, a new tool for anti-Semitism. I talked about this a little bit in another session. We talked about Durban and Israel's human rights violation. But let me find. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. When anti-Semites seek to delegitimize Israel, they use the language of human rights. Doing so broadens the appeal of anti-Semitism. As Harvard professor Daniel Goldhagen puts it, the language of general humanitarian principles and of universal human rights is used as a cover for people's true motivation, anti-Semitism, for attacking Israel and its Jews. We see anti-Semites using the guise of human rights in 5 specific charges. Jews are racists. Israel is an apartheid country. Jews commit ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. So all of these phrases, which are prominent in the human rights world, are now used to apply to Israel. So, for example, there are people in the Muslim world in the United Nations who believe that the law of return, which says that any Jew can immigrate to the state of Israel, is racist. That's a racist law, because you are privileging one group because of their biology or their conversion to Judaism. You are privileging them over another group. And when Israel enters into, just yesterday, 2 days ago on NPR, I turned it off because one of my kids was in the car, so I didn't want them to hear it. But I heard the beginning of the story was essentially a story about a 12-year-old in the Gaza Strip who is constantly, running out of her home when there are bombings from Israel. I mean, it was an awful story. I feel bad for the girl, of course, but essentially the idea is that Israel is targeting Palestinians and making their life miserable, and in some cases even deliberately trying to kill Palestinians. That's what sort of the very far left of the spectrum believes, and that kind of propaganda is filled in Arab newspapers and propaganda. And even the motif of Israel as Nazis. There have been pamphlets produced where Israeli soldiers are depicted as Nazis and Palestinians are depicted as persecuted Jews with a yellow star. And so this kind of language of protecting the victim and of human rights is applied in an anti-Semitic context. And that's a new form of anti-Semitism. This is, how I've talked about how anti-Semitism is a virus and it mutates. Well, now this language of human rights is used, especially in the Muslim world, but even more broadly in parts of the Christian world, as a tool for anti-Semitism. Questions so far? Questions about human rights? Okay. The other part of sort of contemporary Muslim anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews as a religion, that's fine, but Jews are not a nation. So there shouldn't be a Jewish state because Jews should be essentially like the dhimmi people. They should be second-class citizens in Arab countries, which they historically have been. But for Jews to have their own state is a distortion of Judaism. And in fact, this is what, when people would say to Yasser Arafat, "You're an anti-Semite," he would say, "No, I'm not. I believe Jews can live in Arab countries. That we have nothing against Jews, and we have nothing against Jews and Judaism. We're against the existence of a Jewish state." Isn't that interesting? Now, why is that? Which actually, that definition itself actually points to one of the key differences between historic Christian anti-Semitism and historic Muslim anti-Semitism. Historic Christian anti-Semitism was against Judaism. Essentially, Islamic anti-Semitism is against Jewish nationalism. And so the idea that Jews should have their own state is considered that is what modern Muslim anti-Semites say is the is what they object to. Now you might say, well, okay, do they have a point there? Well, no, because this is part of the sort of self-understanding of Judaism, is that Jews have always been a nation and a people, not just a religion. Remember, I think I've talked about this before, that Jews are, there's no word for religion in Torah. There's only a word for, Jews are known as Bnei Yisrael, the children of Jacob. So we are a nation, essentially, before we are a religion. So for a group to say, well, Judaism as a religion is fine, Jews as a nation is wrong, that's essentially anti-Semitic, because it's saying my definition of who you are is right, and your definition of who you are is wrong. Interesting. So now, by the way, this is actually kind of interesting, because there are some Jews who actually don't believe that that Jews should have a nation of their own. Remember, it's very interesting. Theodor Herzl wanted to have the first Zionist Congress meeting in Berlin, because Berlin was a big city, and this is, the end of the 19th century, and he wants to have the World Zionist Congress in Berlin. Well, the Jews of Berlin succeeded in preventing that from happening. And you know how it worked is the Reform Jews of Berlin and the Ultra-Orthodox Anti-Zionist Jews of Berlin agreed on one thing, that there shouldn't be a Zionist conference in Berlin, because the Reform Jews believed that Germany is the Jew, that Jews should live as productive citizens of Germany, and we don't need our own country because we live in Germany, we live in Europe. The Ultra-Orthodox believe that only God can reestablish the Jewish state. Jews cannot. We wait for God. So they formed an alliance. That's why the first Zionist Congress was held in Bern, Switzerland, rather than Berlin. Bern was not a major city. But the idea that Jews constitute a nation as well as a religion, that is a biblical idea, but there are some Jews who don't believe in it. So there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who live in Israel who are anti-Zionist, which may seem very strange, but it exists. And their view is that Israel is just like any other state. It's just like any other state. We're living in Israel, and it's nothing special. It would be just the same as if we were living in Tsarist Russia. We have our own community. We want the state to leave us alone. We'll pay our taxes if we pay any taxes, and if the state gives us some extra money, great. But we're not going to serve the state. The state isn't anything special to us. I was on TV once with a guy who believed this, and he was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. I forget. It was on Newsmax. This is like 4 or 5 years ago, and it was so strange to have a dialogue with this guy. It was very strange, because let's say this same group protests outside of AIPAC. They're ultra-Orthodox Jews who are opposed to a Jewish state. And so now, why is that relevant to anti-Semitism? Because those same arguments are used by anti-Semites to say Judaism is abusing, that Jews are abusing their power by creating a nation state, and that nation state oppresses others and it murders others in order to achieve power. And that is a major, major source of contemporary anti-Semitism. What do you think about that? What do you think about Jews who don't believe there should be a Jewish state? Is there any legitimacy to that argument?
Jill?
Hi. If Judaism is a nation, is a state, then does that say that I'm an Israeli?
No.
I thought I was an American Jew.
Not at all. Not at all. So what it says is, Jews are a nation and a religion and all of the above. And a nation, the contemporary structure of a citizen of a nation state, that's modern. You don't have to be a citizen of a country in order to feel a connection to that nationality. So an Italian American doesn't have to be a citizen of Italy. You can have that heritage as part of who you are, and you feel something special when you go back to Italy, maybe, but you aren't a citizen of that country. And I think that's the same thing with American Jews, that you feel a resonance, a connection with Israelis, but it's their country. You're not a citizen of that country. You don't pay taxes to that country. But it is complicated. It is complicated because, what if Israel was like Iran? What if it was a theocratic state that did things that were so opposed to our value as Americans that we didn't feel any kinship? That's a whole certain. Now, there are certain Jews today who actually believe that, and that to me goes a little too far. But there is that can become a source of tension when our values aren't aligned. So long as American values and the values of the state of Israel are basically aligned, not perfectly aligned, nothing's perfectly aligned. You know, Israel's a democracy, but it's not a democracy the same way. But as long as our values are somewhat consistent, it doesn't present a problem. But if our values were totally inconsistent, it would be a problem. That may happen in the future. But in general, to say that Jews are a nation is not to say that we are citizens of Israel. It's simply to say that we feel a connection to Jews who are living in other countries. I think that's probably the best way to put it. That if you are a Christian in America, the fact that you don't feel a connection to a Christian even in China, it doesn't have the same level of feeling of mutual responsibility that Jews feel towards one another. That's because we are a nation, not a political nation necessarily, but a people.
I would challenge you on that. What about missionaries? But Avi asked, how do these ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists living in Israel feel about the settlements?
They actually don't like the settlements in general. Most of them don't live in, they may live in settlements, but they're not out there defending them. It's essentially, it's so complicated. It's so complicated. The whole idea of peoplehood is very complicated too. I'm kind of oversimplifying because there really isn't. Jews don't fit into contemporary categories. Contemporary categories say that there is a separation between religion and state. That's the American, separation of church and state. And as American Jews, most of us probably are very pro separation of church and state. But that is a Western idea. Traditional Judaism, there's no separation between the state and the religion. It's part of one. Even in 19th century Europe and 17th, 18th century, where Jews lived in ghettos and so forth, the rabbis were the ones who collected the taxes, and passed them on to the civil authority. Religious law and civil law were all part of the same complex. It's only today where we have this notion of religion and nationality being separate. And so traditional Judaism doesn't fit in those categories. So it makes these questions much harder. Now, what was your question again? Settlements and ultra-Orthodox. I think in general, there are so many different shades within Orthodoxy. So there are some ultra-Orthodox who are very Zionist. So they would say settlements are great. There are other ultra-Orthodox who are opposed to settlements and who say anything that expands the power of the modern state of Israel is bad and we will protest. So it's an impossible question to answer because we think there are differences between Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews. Within the Orthodox community, there are enormous differences. And so it's kind of hard to say, but there are both.
Pam?
So if what you just said about kind of religion and the state, Judaism, why, when Israel was set up in 1947, and I don't mean to be naive, why were Palestinians, first of all, or Arabs, they were displaced? And then why right away, you even said that they're second-class citizens. Why was that decision made at the time? Why not be more democratic?
Oh, okay, big question. Big question.
Yeah, and I know.
Yeah. No, it's a hugely important question. And nobody actually knows the definitive answer. This is very hard to say, but I'll give you sort of the different schools of thought. So there were Zionists. Judah Magnus is a perfect example. Judah Magnus was a Reform rabbi in the United States. He served Temple Emmanuel in New York until he was a Zionist. He married the sister of one of the congregation's prominent anti-Zionists, but they tolerated him. Judah Magnus ultimately moves to Israel. He becomes the first chancellor of the Hebrew University. And he believes that the state of Israel should essentially be a binational state, that it should be Jewish and Muslims living in one country. And there were others like him. Martin Buber, who also lived in Israel and taught at Hebrew University, believed that the state of Israel should be essentially a binational state. And that was a prominent voice in early pre-state Zionism. Now, why did that not come about? Well, most Israelis and Zionists will say the reason that didn't come about is most Arabs were not okay with it. They believed that the state of Israel would not last. So that when the state was declared by the UN in 1947, and there was a war almost immediately following, that Israel would fall during that war. And there were Arabs, Egyptians, and so forth, who said to Palestinians, leave your home for a few weeks, we'll fight this war, we'll win, there'll be no state of Israel, and you go back. That didn't happen. And that's, according to, that's where the refugee camps were first established. So and then when that happened, the Israelis who won said, we're never going to be able to live at peace with Arabs, because clearly they just want us off the face of the earth. So those earlier binational Zionists, like Judah Magnus, like Martin Buber, were thought to be just totally naive. And what happened was Arabs who lived in the new state of Israel, they were not really second-class citizens, except by the fact that they didn't serve in the army, but they had all the rights. They could vote. I mean, they're somewhat economic second-class citizens, because it's almost like how, racism works in the United States. The difference between, Black wealth and white wealth in America is big, and there's a variety of reasons for that. And essentially, the difference between Arab wealth and Jewish wealth, or Muslim wealth and Jewish wealth in Israel proper, even though everyone can vote, there are major differences. But they're technically not second-class citizens, except in the fact they don't serve in the army. However, in the territories, that a different type of law predominates. So why did it happen that kind of dream of a binational state? The most Israelis will say because Arabs never really wanted it, and when they lost the war the first time, they still wanted to conquer Israel, and then when they lost the war the second time, we knew it was impossible. Now, there are some radical leftist Israeli historians who say, actually, Israelis never really wanted that to begin with. That instead of there are Israeli historians who believe that Palestinian villages were massacred during the 1947-1948 war. There is some evidence for that. There's some evidence that they weren't. But this is a very murky and controversial era of Israeli history. The idea that was there so much tension in the early days between Jews and Arabs? The standard narrative, the one that we usually rely on, says that Arabs never really wanted peace, and there is a lot of evidence for that. But there are other narratives that say, Arabs may not have wanted peace, but Israelis didn't really want it either. So those are the competing narratives.
We have one last question from Susan. Oh, wait, there you go.
Okay. Rabbi.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't usually like to tout my age, but I am old enough to remember when the state of Israel came into being and the aftermath of it. I was a child, but I was in Sunday school, and there was a lot going on about that in my home and in the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I have always understood it is that the Arabs were so against the beginning of the state of Israel And they did attack, as we all know, and they lost.
Yeah.
And after that, they keep talking about the 800,000 Arabs that were displaced. Many of them left on their own accord.
Right.
Because the Arabs told them to leave.
Yeah.
And then they were used by the Arabs.
Yes.
And they were put in displacement camps.
Yes.
And never allowed into the other countries as citizens.
Right.
800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab lands, from Iran, Iraq, which was in Persia at the time, and they were Syria. They all were, and there were no Jewish refugees because Jews that were expelled from there were welcomed into the state of Israel, and they were never used as pawns the way the Arabs used their own people.
Right.
And am I correct? That is the way I always understood it. I understood it that way then, and I still believe it. Am I
Yeah,
wrong?
I mean, no, you're not wrong by any means. I think that is generally, I think, what a lot of historians say happened. It's generally accurate, but history is always murky. There are other historians, including Israeli historians, one very prominent named Tom Segev, Segev, who essentially says a lot of that's true. He said, but he says that Israelis forced a lot of Arabs to leave, that it wasn't just Arabs telling other Arabs to leave. He argues, and he uses, yes, evidence that Israelis pushed Arabs out. So we're not, it's hard to come to a definitive conclusion to say 100% this, 100% that, but how you described it is how I've always understood it. And there are lots of historians who understand it that way, but there are certain respected historians who say the narrative is slightly different. Again, we won't know for sure, you know, we're not going to find out the truth from Arab sources, but also the early Zionists, they had their own, you know, there are some historians who say, and this is going to strike some of us as really terrible and awful to say it, but there are some historians who say that Israelis, like Zionists, like David Ben-Gurion, didn't really do as much as they could to fight the Nazis because they believed that ultimately World War II would be good for the founding of Israel, that they didn't do everything they could to bring attention to what was happening because they believed that this was the death of Jews in Europe, which would ultimately be good for the founding of the state of Israel. That's a very controversial argument to make, but there are historians in Israel who make that argument. That's not, you know, some crazy, you know, anti-Semite. So a lot of this history is quite murky, you know, and that's why we discuss it. That's why we learn. So I wish all of you, we're not on for next week. Next week we're off for Thanksgiving, but I will see all of you in a couple of weeks, and I wish you a happy, sweet, healthy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving. Bye.
Thanks. Everybody have a good holiday.
You too.
Thank you. That was wonderful.